Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video I thought I would talk about Putin's recent threat that he made in his televised address. And in that he stated, not a threat really, actually an action, that he would start a partial mobilization, no such a thing exists, as opposed to full mobilization, and he also made a nuclear threat. He reminded people that he had nuclear weapons and that they would be used to protect the sovereignty of Russian territory, and he added the words, "I am not bluffing." Well, the man clearly is bluffing, and I'm going to go into the reasons why. And I'm a bit surprised, to be honest, that he's doing this, because he was supposed to be someone who was adept at manipulating people, adept at manipulating the situation. And really, he seemed to have demonstrated otherwise, which rather surprises me. Now, you can take the view that he had done this because he is stupid, deranged, psychopathic, or any other word that you wish to use. But there's an important lesson here, because many people do use threats in a negotiation, and many of them use threats badly, with sort of unintended consequences. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk through that and to use Putin as an example of how not to do it. Now hopefully Putin or his crowd are not watching this video, as apart from the fact that I've just insulted a despot and would rather not have polonium in my tea. I also would not want to be giving him any advice on how to improve his abilities to make threats. Fortunately, I don't have too many people watching this channel, so I shall crack on. For anyone new to this channel, I am the Collaborative Negotiator. I'm a professional negotiator with over 10 years of experience, and I, among my many other things, I teach people how to negotiate. So I like to use current events as good examples and talk through things in the context of a negotiation, using the language of negotiators, shall we say. So let's crack into this then. Let's talk about this deranged maniac and his particular threat that he has made. Now there are a number of components worth going into on this, and I thought I'd just quickly set a little bit of the context, because context is always important whenever you try to do any kind of threat in a negotiation. First context, this is not the first time he had made this threat. In fact, he's done it several times before. And needless to say, if you have to keep repeating the threat, and if you have to keep adding the words "I am not bluffing," then that kind of tells you there's a problem, that people are not taking your threat particularly seriously because they think you are actually bluffing. So there is that. And that should be one obvious clue that the threat is not being taken seriously. And as with anything in any kind of negotiation, I talk about credibility a lot. Anything you say in negotiation, whether that is putting forward a position or whether that is making a threat even, it has to be credible. If you as a negotiator are not credible, then you are not going to succeed in that negotiation. So right now, Putin oddly has little credibility here, although even though we should never sort of underestimate the man. He is, apart from his many other non-redeemable features, he's generally known for carrying out what he says he will do. However, that is not working in the context of the nuclear threat. And part of the reason for that is because it is seen as so disproportionate to the issue at hand. So of course, the Russian army is being clobbered in Ukraine. They are not succeeding in their objectives. So, but untenable or unpleasant as that might be for Putin, the use of nuclear weapons to remedy that situation is grossly disproportionate. And this is the thing about a threat. If you make a threat that is grossly disproportionate, then people automatically aren't going to believe you. Now, this is no way of context to say, I'm not trying to say that Putin is not a dangerous individual. He clearly is. He clearly had no regard for human life. He's clearly willing to kill quite a lot of people in a variety of unpleasant ways, usually involving chemical, biological, or radiological agents. But when it comes to a nuclear threat, there is the nuclear taboo. And it is a thing. It is very much understood at sort of global level, world leader level, that the first idiot that fires a nuclear weapon is immediately a target for everybody else. That is the nuclear taboo. And Putin knows this. Putin knows that if he does a first strike with a nuclear weapon, then his days are numbered. Whether that be from Western powers, whether that even be from his own side. This is because of the nuclear taboo. So the thought that Putin is going to nuke Ukraine or anywhere else because he is not the Russian army is not able to secure a chunk of land that has no particular strategic value to Russia is quite ludicrous. So why would he make such a threat, you might argue? Well, all I can say to that is that a man who has spent a lifetime having people jump to his every command is obviously not used to rejection. So sorry, Mr. Putin, the Ukraine people are just not that into you, really. It's not you, it's them. Actually, no, it is you. So really, Putin is not getting what he wants. So he's making these threats not with the intention of carrying it out, but with the intention of simply intimidating others into giving him some of what he wants. So really, Putin is bluffing because he is hoping that the others will not bluff or will take his bluff seriously. That's the problem. He is relying on other people not taking his bluff seriously. Or not actually doing something about it. It's a very strange context. So really, this is whatever angle you wish to look at this is very much a failed threat. So that's enough about Putin himself and his deranged views of the world. Let's talk about actually conducting a threat. In the context of negotiation, many people will usually make a threat to try and improve their position. So if you are the recipient of a threat, then normally you've got a variety of options. But usually they fall in two categories. You either de-escalate the situation or you escalate and you push back. Those are kind of your two options when addressing any kind of threat scenario. Now the example I want to use here, which I think is particularly applicable, is that of a toddler with a loaded firearm. Let's compare Putin to a toddler with a loaded firearm. Very apt. So imagine you're a parent, you come along and your toddler has grabbed a firearm, obviously not in the UK because that doesn't happen, but probably in the US and other places. And your toddler is having a bit of a ludicrous demand that they're going to pull the trigger of the firearm unless they get what they want. And that might be, later bedtime, a new game for their computer, whatever it may be, a completely ludicrous demand. Now that demand is not credible. It is not, and it is ludicrous. However, you're dealing with a toddler without perhaps a full grasp of the implications of the situation, and you're dealing with a loaded firearm. Therefore, you have to take that threat seriously, even though the threat itself is not credible and is ludicrous. Now, obviously, many people would yell at that toddler, and they would say, you put that down immediately or else. And your else would be, you're grounded, you'll be punished, we'll have your toys taken away from you, etc., etc. So you're immediately escalating and pushing back on the toddler and telling them that there will be significant repercussions for what they're doing. The other way you can go is you can try and reassure them. You can try and de-escalate. And you would do that by saying, put that down immediately, and if you do so, I'll give you a lollipop or an ice cream, something like that. Having successfully de-escalated, diffused the situation, And the responsible parent would then have a very long conversation with that toddler about the dangers of firearms. Now, going back to Putin, a man who is nearly 70 years old, I believe, I think the days of gently easing him down and explaining to him the errors of his ways are perhaps long gone. So you automatically know that in the context of Putin and his threat, that de-escalation and offering him incentives, if you like, is not going to work. When dealing with that toddler with the firearm, that parent will take steps to make sure it never happens again. They will make that toddler promise never to go near a firearm again. They will lock it up in a more secure location. They will threaten severe repercussions, etc., etc. Because if they didn't do that, then the toddler might learn that they can get a reaction that they want by repeating that threat. And that is essentially what Putin's trying to do. That is perhaps what he has learned. That he just intimidates people, repeats the threat, and they tend to give him what he wants. And you can only go so far with that before you hit the brick wall of reality, and people will just reach a point where they say, no more, not accepting it. So that means that when it comes to dealing with a threat like Putin, you can't really go down the appeasement route. And very few people, everyone acknowledges that is the choice. They don't have that choice with Putin, which is part of the problem why his threat has failed. He doesn't have a de-escalation, a valid means of de-escalating, or others to de-escalate him. It is literally, no, you cannot have it. And that is one of the things that people have to be careful of when they're making any kind of threat during a negotiation. Is that usually you're negotiating with someone who has some form of choice in the matter. They're able to make a decision to escalate or de-escalate. If you threaten that to someone as more powerful, then obviously they will just threaten you back. And they may be able to threaten more serious repercussions than your original threat. So in the case of Putin, the repercussions of his threat, or escalating significantly, are quite horrific, which is why no one particularly wants to do that. So what will be happening is that people will be setting very clear boundaries back at him. And those clear boundaries will no doubt be along the lines of don't even think of using nuclear weapons, or NATO will take action and take away whatever it is that he wants. And there's a variety of things. I'm not going to sort of speculate as to what the options that people may pursue are. So what I'm trying to say here is that Putin's threat lacks credibility. And so in any negotiation sense, if you do make a threat, you should have to do so very sparingly, and you have to make sure it is credible. This is not to say that there isn't an element of validity to that threat. It is a serious threat. It should be taken seriously. But a threat is usually made in the context of a demand. And in this case, Putin's demands are not reasonable. He just wants Ukraine to give up territory. And he wants the Western nations to support that demand. But they do not agree. They do not consider it to be a reasonable demand. And therefore, against the serious nature of the threat, they do not consider that there's much room for compromise, shall we say. So, in any threat sense, if you force people down a binary choice, where there isn't scope for genuine compromise, then you should expect a bit of a binary answer. And that is what Putin has done, and I don't think he's going to get the answer he wants or likes. Now, there's something else I also want to talk about in the context of making threats, which is also very applicable here. I've talked about context of making a threat. And the way I articulate this is that when you're preparing for any kind of negotiation, you need to identify what is a tradable and what is a principle. So in a very simple sense, Tradables are things that people can compromise on. Principles are things that people, by the very definition of being a principle, should not be compromising on. So, for example, silly example, I know, you're never really going to negotiate someone into committing murder because that goes against their principles. But you might be able to negotiate someone into being unpleasant to someone else because that is something that they could perhaps compromise, albeit reluctantly, on. To use a silly example. Now this is important in the context of making threat in a negotiation. So making a valid threat in a negotiation and exploiting someone's tradables is usually something you would do on price. So you might be having a negotiation with a supplier and you might say your price is too high. So you may then threaten that supplier. We don't like the price, we are going to switch to a different supplier. And to make that threat credible, you will have done the research and you will have identified what other suppliers are charging. And you may use that information as part of your threat to the supplier. I know that so-and-so suppliers are charging, X amount for the goods and services that we're ordering. What are you going to do to persuade me not to move to that supplier? That is a valid threat to make in the context of a negotiation. But you can only go so far with that. And in that example, I've told you how far you can go. You know that supplier, that there's a target they have to meet. They know their competitors are offering a better price. Now, if that supplier is unable to match that price, for example, they've got more expensive labour costs or more expensive goods that form part of the service, then there's a point they cannot go past. So you know that if you try to push them past that point, you will lose that supplier. And fine, if you genuinely have the choice of moving to another supplier, you're not going to be too fussed about it. If, however, you're very dependent on that supplier and actually you were bluffing and you didn't want them to move, you just wanted them to drop the price, then it is very important that you understand where that point is, where the part they cannot exceed. Because if you make too strong a threat and push too severely for them to compromise, then you lose that supplier and you lose whatever it is the objective. You're not actually getting a better price, you're now going to incur significant expenses moving to another supplier, for example. So this is one of the examples why people get threats very wrong. They may make threats just expecting people to compromise, but without fully understanding the context or the extent to which those people can compromise. If you don't have that information, then you can be pushing someone into an untenable position. Now, in contrast to that is a principle. And let's go back to the Ukraine situation and Putin. NATO and the West are supporting Ukraine not because of the tradable. They're not supporting Ukraine because they want to get better concessions from Putin. I mean, yes, maybe the Chinese and the Indians are when it comes to paying for oil and gas, but that's not relevant in this context. The West aren't trying to use sanctions or use their support for Ukraine to make Putin invade less. They're basically trying to punish him, to deter him fully. And they're doing that in the belief that of the principle that it is wrong for Putin to be invading Ukraine and to take territory. So when Putin tries to counter their action by making a threat of nuclear weapons or mobilization and so on, he is going up against a principle, not a tradable. And if you try and do that in negotiation, then you're instantly on a path to failure. People have red lines. Sometimes they're principles, sometimes it is a not to exceed cost, for example. But when it is a principle, the only way you can negotiate someone into moving away from that principle is by reframing their points of reference. So for example, you persuade them that that principle is not where they think it is. They ought to move it somewhere else. So in the context of Ukraine, Putin needs to change the Western attitude into believing that Ukraine is worth supporting, for example. He needs to change their reference. He needs to make them believe that Ukraine is not worth supporting because they don't deserve it. Instead, he is trying to bully them into thinking Ukraine is not worth supporting because the risk is too high. But when people are doing something in the context of a principle, then their appetite for risk can be exceedingly high indeed. They feel what they are doing is morally justified. And so when you have that morally justified bar, then you have a very significantly high bar to overcome if you wish to shift people from that position. And Putin has completely and utterly failed to do that. So this is why it is important to understand the difference between a tradable and a principle in terms of conducting any kind of negotiation. You can get people to compromise on one, you cannot get them to compromise on principles. You have to adopt a completely different approach. So what conclusion can we really draw from this example by Mr. Madman Putin? Well, really, his threat has betrayed his weakness. He has had to say, I am not bluffing. And when you have to say something like that, then people automatically think that you are kind of bluffing, really, because, you know, if they take you seriously, you don't need to say it. It's one of those weird little contradictions. People can also see that the war is going extremely badly. Even in the context of him carrying out mobilization, there's still some fundamental questions as to whether even mobilization will be enough to turn the tide of battle in Ukraine. Things are that bad for the Russian army. So in that context, Putin is looking exceedingly weak. He has very few options. He has very few genuine ways that he can manipulate the situation outside of Russia to make people change their views, change their actions. So he has resorted to threats. But what has happened along with everything else is that all his actions, and they are actions as well as threats, have all failed to have the impact that he had desired. He had failed to take territory in Ukraine. He had failed to break the will of Europe to continue to support Ukraine despite being cut off from gas. He had failed to shift the Americans in any way, shape or form, or even to cower them with the threat of nuclear weapons, because of course they have their own. So all he can do is bluster, and that is exactly what he is doing. And unfortunately this is not very reassuring, because it demonstrates that he is rather desperate. For someone as strongly minded as Putin to end up looking desperate, you can only wonder just how bad the internal situation in Russia must be. Do those around him genuinely think that he should be removed, he is a threat to the national security of Russia? Wouldn't be surprised if that was the case, which is no doubt why he won't let anyone within 20 feet of him. So I hope that you found this explanation about threat dynamics in the context of negotiation useful. No doubt there will be more to say about what happened in the context of the Ukraine war, because it is becoming quite clear, and it has been clear for a long time to be honest, that Putin now needs some kind of peace deal. He needs some kind of ceasefire to get himself out of the hole that he is in. And right now he is running out of options. The gas option is not working, cutting off the West from gas. The sending in more troops to Ukraine option is not working. Perhaps trying to create destabilizations elsewhere. He doesn't seem to be doing very well at that either. And so literally all he's got left is waving around his nuclear weapons like a toddler with the loaded gun. And of course, no one particularly respects a toddler with a loaded gun. So, albeit anyone with any sense does fear what the consequences might be if you don't deal with that situation. And that is exactly what Putin is right now. So I hope you found this video interesting. And for anyone conducting further, if you want to conduct threats in a context of negotiation, please do send me comments or any questions in the box below. I will be happy to answer them.